Okay.
Um, or maybe my work with the CIA, you know.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I'll try to avoid that. Right, the things that are classified.
No, the Culinary Institute of America.
Oh,
Yeah.
that one. Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one. All right. Well, I'm speaking today with Timothy Kramer, an American composer and a founding member of CASA, the Composers Alliance of San Antonio. Tim was born in Seattle and has degrees from Pacific Lutheran University as well as the University of Michigan. He's won a number of awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Fulbright Scholarship, grants from the NEA, New Music USA, the MacDowell Colony, and the Artist Foundation of San Antonio. Tim recently became Professor Emeritus at Illinois College in Jacksonville, Illinois, so congratulations on that. Prior to moving to Illinois, though, he served as my predecessor at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, teaching courses in music theory and composition, a position that I now occupy. We still use your alma mater at Trinity, Tim. And with that, let's begin the conversation. Did I get any of that wrong?
No, not at all.
All right. Well, very good.
Good
I'm
summary.
very happy to be speaking with you today. You were, by popular demand, the next target of these interviews with the rest of the members of CASA. So you and I have known of each other for at least a decade. We spoke on the phone once shortly after I took the position at Trinity. And I
Mhm.
remember you were extolling the virtues of Taco Taco, which apparently was one of your favorite places to eat while you were here. And we met once at, it must have been, it was a concert at UIW, possibly one of those Made in SA concerts that we've put on. But otherwise, thanks to the pandemic, a silver lining is that we've seen each other in person a lot more, albeit online like
Mhm.
this. So, well, I'm always interested in people's backgrounds and how they got started off as a composer. Now, I know that you're from Seattle, though you didn't grow up there. Is that right?
No, I grew up in Pasco. I lived in Seattle for, well, actually it was Bellevue, but Seattle area for about 6 months before my parents moved to the Tri-Cities, which is in eastern Washington, Pasco, Kennewick, Richland. So I grew up in Pasco. It's a small town. Well, it's very similar in some ways to where I am now, a
Mm-hmm.
town of about 20,000 people with one high school um, and no internist. So that's why my father took a job there
So your
as a
father was a
physician.
physician, correct?
Hmm.
What was his specialty?
Yeah, internal medicine.
Internal medicine.
Hmm. And
And your
hematology.
and your mother was a stay-at-home mom, right?
Stay-at-home mom. Hmm. She worked through different jobs part-time when dad was going through medical school, of course, and did a few things, but mostly, yep, stay-at-home mom. And
My wife is a stay-at-home mom to our three kids, and even though she has a PhD in theater, and we just never knew, you know, of course we'd hoped that both of us would end up with careers, preferably at the same university or at least in the same town, but just didn't end up that way. So I have a lot of respect. She works harder than I do, actually, when it
now,
comes to raising the kids and all the stuff that comes with that. But yeah, your town sounds a lot like where I grew up in Georgia, a town of maybe 15 to 20,000 people, one high school. Not a lot of musical opportunity there, though. For instance, there was no orchestra, no strings in any of the K through 12 programs where I grew up. There was band and marching band because football was big.
mhm.
Other than that, it was choir and band. No music theory, no music appreciation in the high schools at all. But anyway, your parents must have obviously cultivated an interest, or at least assisted with your interest in music. Were either of them musicians?
No, neither of them were trained musicians. They were both very musical. My mother had piano lessons when she was young, and she was still able to play the piano pretty well. Could read hymns and things of that nature. Um, and Dad was very musical, but mostly sang and played the harmonica.
Right
But
on.
yeah, a similar situation, I think, in terms of you know, in that small town, you mostly had your musical experiences were with a private teacher and with a group of other kids who were taking lessons, primarily in the piano studio that I studied in when I was pretty young. But they did have, well, they had an orchestra, I think, when I was young at the high school, but it dissolved by the time I got into high school. And
It's too
we
bad.
did have because there are three cities there, so there are about 100 to 150,000 people. There's a Mid Columbia Symphony Orchestra, which I grew up hearing. Community orchestra plays something like 4 or 5 concerts a year, but it wasn't standard practice to go to them or hear them. So most of the experiences I had were private lessons, starting off on piano. And I have two older brothers, and they both took piano lessons too. So I was just coming up and
You're joining
doing
the
that at
crowd.
pretty young age. And I actually say, thinking about it now, I had an aunt who lived in town, my mother's sister, and she had a kindergarten called Musical Kindergarten, and it was, I guess it's the Kindermusik, it's and I did that when I was very young. It was before I went to kindergarten, and it was basically you learned about music and you learned about other things while you were doing this musical kindergarten. I think it was in the afternoons. I can't remember how long, maybe a couple hours. But she had a giant keyboard on the ground that you'd step on and walk on the keys, and then you'd sing the solfege syllables as you walked up and down. And so
Wow.
I think a lot of that early training was key in terms of listening, listening to music and singing and learning to clap and read rhythms. That was before I even took piano lessons at the age of, I must have been 6 or 5 or something like that. It was pretty young.
No,
So,
that's incredible. I wish I had one of those keyboards for my oral skills classes. That'd be fun.
right. Well, it's funny, as I think about it, describing it, I've described it before to students, and there's a certain point where you can't remember where you learned where those things came from. It's pretty far back, and I do remember, when I was very young, before even piano lessons, like sitting in my mother's lap, and she'd point out a key to me, and then we'd play something, and so certain things that happen, you're singing along when you're young. You're like a sponge, you're soaking up things. So I think most of my musical training was probably, the hard wiring was done by the time I was like 6 or 7 years old.
Oh, that's great. How fortunate that you had an aunt who had that Kinder music program and you had all that, you know, that wiring that was being installed. So
Right.
at what age then did you begin training in piano?
Well, I think it was, I guess, I don't know, how old are you in the first grade? I think it wasn't kindergarten. Probably
Probably 6.
6 years.
Yeah.
I think I was 6 probably. And I practiced ferociously because I loved it. I would come home after school and I know I would just play for 2 hours, just either practicing or making things up and
Right.
practicing and um, memorizing. I could memorize much faster back then, you know, um, as we all could when we were younger. Again, it's learning really quickly. But then also in grade school, I had a friend who brought a ukulele back, I think from, I don't know whether his parents brought it back from Hawaii, but eventually, by like the third or fourth grade, I was playing a ukulele, and then I would had another uh, friend, family friend, who had a baritone uke, and we would play things together. And then I started taking guitar lessons, and for at least a few years while I was taking piano lessons, and then from there I switched to bass guitar by junior high school. We used to call it middle school. So I was I don't know, 10 years old or something like that. I guess 12 years old. And I played bass pretty consistently through um, junior high school and high school. I also took percussion lessons for a year or two with a drummer. But all of these were private lessons or private things that I did, except for the bass guitar, which in junior high I would play in the jazz band, and they actually had me playing in the concert band. I remember at one point too, because they didn't have a tuba, so they just put me on bass guitar, and that became fairly significant for me. So as I went through junior high school and high school, um, playing bass guitar was sort of my identity. It was, I did sing in the choir. We had a choir, but our jazz band was probably the most significant ensemble in high school. And I played bass in the jazz band. I could also play piano, obviously. So occasionally I would if they needed that. But primarily it was bass guitar, electric bass.
Hmm.
I never played upright bass. And so that became sort of the training. So my background in terms of musical orientation was popular music, of course, um, classical piano music, up through maybe the microcosmos of Bela Bartok or something like that, and some contemporary pieces, popular pieces. And so I knew Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven at a pretty young age, but then I thought there was this big gap, and in the 20th century, I thought it was all R&B and funk, and because that's what I was playing, and big band music because I was playing in the jazz ensemble. So I also went to a couple summer camps, jazz camps that were held down at I think Portland was one of them. Would play in jazz festivals. University of Idaho had a big jazz festival. So I ended up meeting in high school some really great, jazz legends. Like I played bass with the drummer Louis Bellson. I played bass with the vibraphone player Lionel Hampton. Again, these were through camps or through festivals. So that was kind of the background. I didn't really know about contemporary music, classical contemporary music, or anything of that nature until I went to college. And, oddly enough, I'd never heard of the Rite of Spring until I think I was a first year or maybe a sophomore in a music history class. And then I was kind of angry that someone hadn't presented this work to me earlier, because I had all these other experiences, but I didn't know about all the music of Shostakovich or all the music of Prokofiev or any of the greats of the 20th century. Certainly Schoenberg was never mentioned until I went to college. So um, that sort of opened up a brand new world for me. So that's kind of the arc of my education, mostly private lessons and some individual things, and then really very active in high school with bass guitar and arranging for that ensemble. I did some arranging of popular
Hmm.
songs for that ensemble
So
too.
I didn't know until you just said it here that you played bass guitar and played it pretty seriously for a number of years. Do you still play?
I can't play it very well. I'm in a loosely organized jazz quartet here called the Illinois College Faculty Jazz Quartet. It's just made up of faculty members part-time and retired faculty members of Illinois College. And I play piano in that group. I'm more comfortable, obviously, because I've been playing the piano since graduate school. But
Sure.
the electric bass was really important. I mean, I played it also in college. Um, and then at some point, when I started to write more music, I gravitated back towards the piano. And I even played bass guitar in graduate school. I played it seriously, like in William Bolcom's Songs of Innocence and Experience. I was the electric bass player in the pop group in that giant ensemble. Um, but the only other experience I had in college was I played in a polka band, a wedding band, and eventually the bass guitar that I liked to play was stolen, and I received some insurance money, and at that point I was interested in going to Europe, so I kind of took the money and used it to go to Europe,
Take the
and
money and
then
run.
I came back and I have a very bad kind of a imitation Rickenbacker bass that's not very good. It's not very easy to play, and it just waned, as you get into teaching theory and composing music and not playing in groups.
Mhm.
Now I don't have the fingers for it, so
Well,
my wife
I,
always wants me to play it, but I can't do it anymore.
uh, well, this is pure speculation, but Tim, would you say that your years of playing the bass influenced your compositional style at all?
Probably. Um, I often mention in my bio, of course, things like the influence of popular music on my own music, and it certainly comes up um, that I do have very active bass lines. I'm interested in that motion, and typically the kind of rhythmic energy that I like from popular music will come up in my music too. So I think it's still there. Um, and there's nothing like the music that you grow up on as the
Mhm.
music that you love, right? We all sort of, as teenagers, we just adhere to that music. It becomes a part of our life. And if you have an enjoyable childhood, and I did, um, that becomes really significant to you. It sort of speaks in a way that other music doesn't. So, any kind of funk bands or R&B or something like that from the immediately identify with, and it would take me back to those days. So I think that's
You've currently frozen on my screen, Tim. Are you still there?
I am.
Okay, yeah, we just
How's
had a little
that?
bit of a hiccup there. Well, I brought up the question about the bass guitar and influence on your music because I have a student right now who's a tuba player, and she always writes bass lines first before melody.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, and so she pays very careful attention to the bass part, and go figure, right? But
Yeah.
I didn't know if maybe something similar you notice in your own music, but
No, no, just textures, but I just think that's um, if it's a really interesting bass line, I always think it's an interesting piece.
can't have a good piece without a good bass line somehow. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Okay, so that was your at least grade 1 through high school education, and then it was off to college. But if I remember, you didn't enroll in college as a music major, did you?
No, no, I didn't. Yeah, it's true. I started, it's interesting is my parents were very supportive of what I did as a musician. But one of the things because I was drumming in grade school and junior high as well, and they said, well, um, how are you going to make a living as a drummer? You should play the
An
bass guitar,
age-old question. Yeah.
right? So, but they weren't too concerned about that. But it was like, maybe you want to play bass guitar. It's like, well, that's more versatile, But um, so when I went to college, I think that wherever I was getting that signal from, you're sort of thinking, well, I do like to design things, and I was fairly good at math, um, and I liked the idea of being either an architect or wanted to do sort of monumental architecture, like build large bridges or viaducts, things like that. That kind of appealed to me. Um, so I went into engineering, and PLU, Pacific Lutheran University, had a 3-2 program with Stanford. And that's what I was interested in doing. 3 years at PLU and then 2 years at Stanford for a master's degree. But when I got to college, there was this course called physics that was much more difficult than I anticipated. And it was one of these classic. I'm a freshman. I'm in the engineering program. I take a design class, sort of in those days a drafting class. And then well, you need to take calculus. Okay, that's no problem. I'll take calculus. And you need to take physics. Okay, I'll take physics. 8 a.m. right? Monday through Friday, or I don't know if it was Monday through Friday or Monday through Thursday. It wouldn't matter much, but 8 a.m. class with a very esteemed physics teacher who was one of these old school physics teachers who just lectured, and if you didn't get it, then you need to study harder, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that course just blew me out of the water. So, and of course, like an idiot, I remember getting a C the first semester in physics, and you think you know everything. I know going into the final I'm going to do fine, and then you end up getting a C, and I think, well, I'll just study harder for physics too. So I took that again. No, another C, and that was the sort of thing that that stopped me. As I often mention to music theory students, which is, when you're building something, as a musician, it's not like it's a bridge that, if you get it wrong, it's going to fall down,
Right. Yeah,
So
the stakes are lower.
yeah, a little bit lower, right?
Mm-hmm.
You might offend someone with some dissonance or offend a critic by making it too long or boring.
You might
But
offend someone with consonants too. So you might
right,
as
you
well
might
just write
offend
whatever you
someone with
want.
consonants. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was so by the sophomore year, the fall of the sophomore year, I was rethinking my options about that. And having an interest in design and sort of sitting at a desk. In fact, the desk that I'm currently sitting at is the desk that I bought. It's kind of an architecture desk. It has, lined grid background, and it's collapsible, and it's a large desk. That desk is sort of where I'm sitting now, and it's the same desk that I design music on. And it starts usually with a visual component, and sometimes a sketch that's very much lined up, even with maybe grid lines about minutes of where articulations are going to happen over a 10-minute interval or a 5-minute interval or a 15-minute interval. So I think those things came together naturally because I was interested in design, and I was interested in sort of controlling different aspects and mechanisms of design. And then also, as a musician, well, what do? You compose music, and that way, you're telling the violist what to do, you're telling the flautist what to do, you're telling a percussionist what to do, and you're in control of this whole process, which would be what an architect would do with, cement and
Right. I mean, a
right,
score,
concrete.
ultimately, a musical score is a blueprint. So
Exactly.
there's a direct analogy to architecture.
Yeah. And I think that was sort of the natural path for me, was to have that very sense of controlling, being able to like control the whole features of a piece. And I actually, in many ways in college, my friends were musicians, but I know I didn't think of myself so much as a musician as a composer. That is, the musicians were the ones who practiced for 8 or 9 hours a day and tried to get better to win the concerto competition and stuff. And for me, it was, no, I need to listen to more music and look at more scores and design things. And I wasn't practicing. I was also an organist. That's the other thing, is in high school, I stopped with piano at about the 9th grade, 10th grade, and I started studying organ, classical organ. And then I went to to school, and I still stayed studying in the organ studio there of David Dahl, one of my dear teachers from Pacific Lutheran University. So I also graduated with a degree, not only in theory and composition, but in organ performance. And I did put on a recital and do all of that. But
And
I didn't practice as much on the organ as I did write music, you know. So
understandable.
yeah.
Also, harpsichord was part of that as well, wasn't it?
Only in graduate school. And
Ah,
that's where, again, I went to Michigan for graduate school. And the first year, well, this is how it worked. I took an incomplete because of all the things I had to do as an undergraduate. I took an incomplete on my senior recital. And the agreement was I would come back in 1 year and play the senior recital, which was not ready to go because I didn't practice.
hmm.
But I did write a really great 30-minute string trio. You know, and
Priorities. Yeah.
and that's right, priorities, you know, and that was my senior project, right? You know, it's a 30-minute string trio. But I ended up going back to graduate school, and then I studied with James Kibbe, who's, I believe, still now chair of the organ program up there at Michigan. I studied with him for 1 year, and it was really interesting because his approach to playing was different from David Dahl's, and I wouldn't say better, but it was just it was different. He was trained on romantic instruments. I had never really played that kind of rep, so I needed to do some work in that area. I've been playing a lot of Baroque music and using early music fingering, and he was into modern fingering, and so we didn't agree on everything, but he did really get my fingering under control. And in any case, he trained me for a year on the organ. But at the end of the year, I had had side discussions with Edward Parmentier, who is a harpsichordist there. And he was more interested in musicology, in early music performance practices, in reading recent dissertations on, you know, string styles and fingerings and Deruda and anything else you can imagine. And I thought, yeah, that's what I really want to do. And so I studied with him, and I had never taken harpsichord before. So I just went into studying the harpsichord, and it just clicked. I mean, I learned a lot from him about music making that extended beyond, you know, Baroque music and early music. And I studied with him for several years in his studio. So and formed friendships there in that harpsichord studio that I still have today. So that's kind of what happened. The progression was piano to organ, organ to harpsichord. And I haven't studied the clavichord yet, but
Well, maybe one day. There's still
maybe
time.
one day. Yeah.
Well, Tim, did you ever go back and complete your senior recital?
I did. It was a very nice program. Somewhere around here, I have a tape of it. It's probably in my office still that I keep over at the college. Um, yeah, it was a nice program. Little Bach B minor,
Mhm.
Prelude and Fugue, and Louis Marchand, and what else was on there? William Bolcom's Black Host. I remember playing that. A little piece by Curtis Smith. I don't know if you know him or not. He was a composer who taught at, I think it was Western Michigan for a while. And was there something else in the program? I'm sure there was Franck, I think, one of the chorales, or um, I think that was it. I think that was the program. It was a nice program.
Well, I'm
You know?
glad you got it done.
Yeah,
'Cause
yeah, it's
I guess,
official. I'm an official, or graduate of organ performance.
right. Well, you mentioned William Bolcom, and I know you studied with him at Michigan. He was one of what, 4 teachers you had at Michigan, something like that?
That's right. Yeah, technically, I guess, well, it was maybe more than four. Um, George Wilson was someone I studied with quite a lot. And of course, I studied electroacoustic music with him and was very interested in that at Michigan. It was, I think I have what would be called a minor cognate field. I mean, at this point, it's very old stuff in my brain, and everything's changed in some way in terms of the tools of electroacoustic music, but that was old school, tape splicing
Right.
and
Right.
analog everything, right?
Right.
Until we had the synclavier, and then we had to learn about programming. And so George Wilson was electronic music. Did I study acoustic music with George? I'm not sure. Maybe. Leslie Bassett, of course, was very important for me, influential, helped me write my first orchestra piece. Um,
William
and
Albright too, right?
William Albright was very important, sort of in between my master's and my doctorate. And because he was also an organist, I never wrote my first organ piece under him. I didn't want to, because I didn't want to have that influence of, but after I'd done it, then I ended up studying with him for a couple of years, and that was very, very enjoyable. And we clicked on different levels because he was a keyboard player and an organist, and understood all kinds of things that I was kind of going through. So yes, I studied with Bill Bolcom, but it wasn't until the latter half of my doctoral work. I even studied with Nicholas Thorne for, I believe it was maybe a year, when he was there as a Rackham Fellow. And I think those were the so 4 plus Nicholas Thorne, and William Bolcom was at the end. And Bill Bolcom was great with the dissertation, which was primarily what I worked on with him, because he just knows, he's his encyclopedic knowledge of things, and could immediately look at the score and say, well, you might try this, and you might look at this, and and a lot of the stuff that I did with him, because it was really over the period of, I guess, 3 years, but it was like 1 year residence, then 1 year on the Fulbright, and then we would just exchange letters in those days.
Wow.
Yes, it wasn't email, it
I
was
remember
just,
those. Yeah.
and it would be, I would send him back, I guess, photocopied sections of things I'd done, and then he would write back to me a letter, and we didn't really talk over the phone. It was too expensive. So
those days are just vanished now.
right. Yeah. But so it was a good, group of people to study with. And
Well, could you take a few minutes, Tim, and just tell me what was it like to study with each of these people? What were their pedagogical styles like, and anything about that?
well, for me personally, I know George Wilson was the one who was probably, the least known of all the composers, and the one who was the most meticulous and really got into your piece. I mean, I think, people said he didn't write a lot of music when he was at Michigan, but I think he actually wrote about 7 or 8 pieces a semester.
Wow, that's
because because it wasn't his music he was writing, it was our music he was writing.
I see.
Yeah. He was very good about getting down to details about how things should operate in a piece, and throwing out examples. And I remember going to a conference. Was this after no, this was, we had it was a Seamus conference, actually, and it was in the 90s, like maybe it was 94 or 96 or something. And I had a piece played there, and it was the piece that he remembered me writing, my last piece that I wrote for him for Michigan, from like 1986. It was like a 10-year-old, just a tape piece. And there was a problem, is a 4-channel piece. And at one point, one of the channels dropped out for like, I don't know, 30 or 40 seconds. We don't know why. And then it came back in. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, what'd you think of the performance? And I said, well, it was kind of nice to have the dancer, And then he said, but there was a problem in the performance, right? Did a channel drop out? Because I missed a part. Now, this is like 10 years, but he knew that work so well that he knew when something was gone. And it was a noisy piece. I mean,
Mhm.
and so you think about the kind of he was the most dedicated, I think, in terms of really getting into student pieces.
Yeah, that's incredible that
Yeah.
he noticed and remembered that.
And Bill Albright was knew a lot about rep and a lot about he would have kind of a, be operating on great instinct, you know, about lengths of events and how long they should operate. And
Can I
in many,
pause you? Can I pause you for a second, Tim? Because
sure.
I had to catch up because you left me reeling for a second there. I thought you said Bill Albright knew a lot about rap, but you said rep. Okay, now I'm back on track now. Okay,
Yeah, not maybe he did know a lot about rap.
maybe.
Yeah. Um, I wrote a piece with him for a guitar and harpsichord, and obviously he knew a lot about writing for the harpsichord and writing for the organ, writing for the piano. Um, and that's where in that piece of mine that some sort of popular music influences are, and uh, his approach. He knew a lot about ragtime, of course, and was involved in kind of ragtime revival, and interested in how popular music sort of worked its way in and out of um, modern classical music sometimes. So that's what I mean by repertoire. It wasn't alien. The jazz and popular music side was not alien to him. I think the
Mhm.
same thing goes with Bill Bolcom as well. Although for the piece that I was working on with Albright, it was just much more obvious the kinds of things that we could talk about that weren't, um, that didn't deal with just technical features, but also deal with like how long something should go on before it becomes boring, or you know what kind of rhythms you're using. And he had a certain instinct that I always felt as though he was a really great composer that was not as well recognized, I think, as Bill Bolcom. Not as much music written, of course, but he had a really great instinct about musical gestures, I think.
Hmm. Well, so that was your MM and your DMA at Michigan, correct?
And they overlapped, yeah, in the
Right.
80s. Hmm.
Well, I think we're missing one piece here. Didn't you also go to the Hochschule für Musik in Germany?
I did.
How did that? Can you tell me about that?
Um, I think it was 88, 89. And so the dissertation for the doctoral work, my exams were all over, my qualifying exams, and the oral exam was all over. And that was, I think I took those in the spring of 88. And so by the summer of 88, I ended up going to Detmold. Now, Martin Redl was not a composer who I knew much about, but um, it's strange how you find out these things. And I think about how we did this in the day before the internet, before email. Um, the way it worked was, oh, I know how it worked. There was so John Anthony Lennon, the composer, who was a Michigan grad who teaches in Kentucky. I think he's at the University of Kentucky. Um, he came to give a short seminar, composer seminar, and he had a list of, because he didn't know who the composers were in Germany. Here are the composers in Germany. And he took like a leave to go and just interview these people and learn about what's going on over there. And so that was a list that I had, and working from that list, I ended up writing to different composers to say, I'm, this is it's 2 years out. I'm interested in studying. I narrowed it down to like 4 or 5 composers. I'm interested in studying with you, and um, I'm going to apply for a stipendiat, a stipend,
Yeah,
a
it's like,
Fulbright fellowship, and if it's successful, I'd like to come and work with you. So what I wanted from each of these composers is sort of a letter of commitment or a letter of interest that they would take me on as a student, because I thought that would add more weight to the Fulbright proposal. So I did that, and interestingly enough, I thought I was going to end up in Nuremberg with Hans Ludwig Schilling, who was a friend of Albright's and sort of like jazz, and was just someone else I thought I would be studying with. And for whatever reason, Fulbright placed me with Martin Radel. And Radel he was on my list. I liked his music. It would definitely aligned with, in fact, his music and my music sounded similar in some ways. He was trained as a percussionist and was a very good percussionist. So I think that maybe the Fulbright committee, I never found out, I don't know. The Fulbright committee said, no, he should go and work with Radel. But in any case, that was my assignment, to go to Detmold. And it actually ended up being a really great thing for me and my wife too, because we were not in a large city like Hamburg, where some of our friends were, or Berlin, which would have been very exciting, but they were having a hard time finding housing, and the stipend didn't go very far. So it was nice to be in a smaller town. It's a cute little town outside of the Teutoburger Wald. It was a nice year, and also they covered Fulbright took care of language training, more intensive language training. I had already been training I played in a polka band, so I knew all the German Fasching songs. But I ended up actually studying German, and my roommate was German ancestry, so we would practice speaking German. But it really helped to go over and have a couple months. I had a couple months at one place, and my wife went to Goethe Institute in Göttingen, and she was there in another place for 2 months training to speak German. So that was a fun year, because it was everything was auf Deutsch, and in a small town too. That really helped because there weren't a lot of English speakers around. And my composition teacher, Martin Radel, Herr Radel, he never spoke in English to me, even though I found out about 8 months into it that he actually did speak English, not too badly,
Sure.
but he just wouldn't speak English to me. And so that was great. I mean, by the end of the year, I felt like I could speak German fairly well, and albeit it was only conversations about music and food.
Well, two of the most important things in life. So
Right. I mean, yeah.
Right. That was one of my questions, was to ask you about your language background and how fluent in German you were going into this whole ordeal. And also, Tim, is your family heritage Germanic at all?
I actually remember writing about that in my proposal, saying that I need to go to Germany. It was primarily to go to research this organ concerto that I was interested in, and that I'd like to see. I wanted to go to different places to visit different organs, and not only see about their construction, but the other thing I mentioned in the proposal was, to link ties with my German heritage. So I'm 3/4 German. My father was all German, and my mother was half German and half Norwegian. So I'm 1/4 Norwegian. But the idea was, right, I played that up. Although I didn't speak German growing up. I think my oldest brother studied German in high school, and maybe the middle brother did too. But I studied Spanish in high school and enjoyed it very much. And that was my first language, was Spanish. But I never spoke Spanish fluently. I mean, I was far from it. It was
Hmm.
a very good Spanish teacher in high school. Um, but I remember when I started to learn German, um, it because I had to have a language also in graduate school, and just for music, German seemed to be really an important language to learn as well.
Ja,
So I
natürlich.
yeah, I ended up studying German, and of course, Spanish would come into my head. It was even when I'd come up with phrases, because I was still translating, of course, and I would just it would come up with um, the Spanish would just pop into my head and try and squeeze the German out. So
Hmm.
it took a while, and it was several years, and I was never very good at it. I mean, I would say that by the end of my time studying there, I was extremely comfortable with walking into a room of German speakers and having conversations and knowing what's going on and being able to respond. But I would never have been able to, was no, I would not call it fluency. I would call
Hmm.
it functioning.
Hmm.
And I could read, which was also important. I could read a newspaper or,
Right.
you know,
Yeah, that's easier than generating.
yeah,
Yeah.
much easier to read. And so even now, a friend of mine who is a German historian, he sends me articles in German, and I can't read them.
Mhm.
Now I'm looking at them and going,
Yeah.
oh my
I wanted to
gosh,
ask, how much do you think you retained? So,
10%,
uh,
and I've actually within the last year, since transitioning, I don't call it retiring, but
mhm.
transitioning from working full time, I have been doing more and more work trying to kind of get that German back. I thought that would be easier than the Spanish because it was more recent, and then I could perhaps use it again just to travel to go to Vienna or Berlin.
Well, if you haven't tried something like the Duolingo program, I would recommend something like that. I mean, it's free. Of course, you could pay to upgrade so you don't have ads and whatever. But
Yeah,
I've
I think
I've been
I think I
using
have.
Duolingo for about the past year for German as well
Oh, have
because,
you?
well, long ago. So, all right, let me see if I can do it. Ich habe für eine Jahre Deutsch studiert, aber
Oh,
ich vergesse alles. You know? So back in college, I studied German for 1 year, but that was a long time ago, right? So I retained
right.
about 10%, as you were just saying.
Yep.
But I found that Duolingo helped kind of unlock those pathways in my head that probably weren't just gone. I just lost access to them, right?
Right.
And so it's been very helpful for that. It was also helpful that until recently here in my neighborhood, I had a good friend who we met through my son's kindergarten class a few years ago. I just a family in the neighborhood, and he was a major in the army, and he was from Germany, but moved to the U.S. when he was young, but retained. He's fluent in German, and they had a daughter who was my son's age, and I loved what they were doing in that he spoke only German to his daughter,
Hmm.
and the mother spoke English, and so the child had daddy's language and mommy's language. He can compartmentalize them that way. And so it's sort of speaking to him and hearing him talk to his daughter for the past few years, that's helped unlock these pathways. Certain synapses were beginning to fire that hadn't fired in 20 years, right?
Hmm.
But they moved recently. Um, their army, so they move, right? So they moved to West Point, and he's actually an instructor of German there. So
Oh, wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
So
a good
he
deal.
knows German. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's one of my big regrets about my own childhood. I mean, I couldn't help this, but I wish I could have. That my father was from Iran, and he came to the US in the late 1960s as a graduate student, and ended up meeting my mother, who was an Iowa farm girl from northern Iowa of Norwegian heritage. And so it's just funny, right? Because I got my mother's lighter hair, lighter skin from the Norwegian genes were more prominent. But I have an older brother who got my father's dark hair, darker skin. So the Persian genes were a little more prominent there. And Well, I wish that my father had only spoken Farsi to me growing up, and my mother had only spoken English. But they had a mentality back then that we're in the U.S., we speak English here, and
Right,
so
right,
they just. I know some Farsi, but I know words mostly about food, and I'm
right.
not fluent at all. And it's a great regret of mine. In fact, I remember back when I was in graduate school, I came home one Christmas break and went back to Georgia, and told my dad that I said, I wish that back when I was a kid, you had only spoken Farsi to me and mom could have only spoken English. And he thought about that and he said, yeah, you're right. We made a mistake. Well, let's try it now. And so for the next few days, he only spoke Farsi to me. I was only home for a few days at Christmas break, and my head just, it hurt. And I thought it might have worked, but there I was probably 24, 25 years old. I'm not a 2-year-old kid. I'm not going to absorb this, especially only over a few days. So anyway, it was a little too late, too little too late for that. But
Well, that's what I think about my German use is that I really pushed myself because I was whatever, 26, 27 when I'm, you know, again, I know some lyrics to German songs. I know some phrases. I'm reading German, so I have the ability to like dissect a sentence and go, this belongs with that. Okay, that's the noun, and but you can't do that when you're speaking. And so for me, it was always pretty clunky. Uh, you know, the sound, or at least I was told by my friends that I sounded pretty good,
mhm.
um, it's because I just imitated what they were saying, and then I would just spit it back to them. Umlauts are always a challenge, of course.
Sure.
You have to really think about the shape of your mouth when you do an umlaut. But I but I think it never comes naturally unless you got that when you're really young, and maybe for me, our family did a trip. We would always do these family vacations. Mom always wanted us to go and see things. So
Mhm.
we would, and typically driving, we're in Washington State, so that, we'd go to Montana or we'd go to Canada or we'd go to California. But one summer we went to Mexico because we had a physician, a friend of ours, who um, went to medical school in Mexico, and he had been a Spanish teacher in high school, and he went back to medical school, and he lived down the street, and he was a friend of ours, friend of my father's, and so he said we have to go to Mexico, and so we drove to Mexico
Wow. From Washington, that's quite a trip.
from Washington. It was quite a trip. Um, and in those days, that was just no problem. We went through like Nogales, and drove down to Mazatlan, and basically stayed there for a few days, and then we flew from Mazatlan into Mexico City and stayed there for a few days, and then back to Mazatlan, and then we drove across the Sierra Madres over to Monterey and stayed there for a few days, and then drove back, all in this giant kind of we used to call it a carryall, but it's kind of like a giant Suburban with
Mhm.
all the things that you'd need for three sons, like um, almost camping gear, and we had a little kind of a camping picnic basket that had all of our cups and a stove, so we could just buy food along the way and kind of go that way. But the point of this is that so I was probably 10 or 11 years old, and my mom had had Spanish in high school, and she still knew some Spanish.
Wow.
And so we were learning Spanish as we went along. We would try out different phrases. And so, I think at that point, that's kind of also when I had more of an interest than when I got into high school. It's like, well, you liked speaking Spanish, and you should just speak Spanish in Mexico because it's certainly going to be a more important language in the United States. And it's true. But
It is true.
because that was my first language, I think that was the one. And when I'm trying to learn German, that it kept coming back in. And even in San Antonio, where I heard Spanish spoken around me, I could still understand something of what was going on. In fact, this is sort of a funny story. You know, Juan Luis is one of my former students from Trinity.
Mhm.
So I remember we were at the Liberty Bar after a concert, and his parents were there, and they were speaking in Spanish, and then he's sort of telling me things, and I said, "No, you don't have to tell me things in English. I kind of know what's going on. You know, I sort of understand the gist of what's being said." And then she she said something to me because I explained it in English and she understood. They spoke enough English that they understand. So I said, yeah, it's strange how when you get a language when you're really young, it sort of sticks with you in ways that you just didn't know. And she says in Spanish, yeah, it's really strange how, you know, you can know something as a child and you know, it sort of stays with you. And then, you know, all of a sudden, you know, like you get hit on the head or something and it all comes back to you just like that. And all of a sudden you can remember a certain event, you know. And so I turned to Juan Luis and I said, he said, did you understand that? And I said, yeah. And I explained it just to him just that way. And his eyes got really big. And I said, yes, Juan Luis, I understood most of the things that you've said to me in Spanish. So,
Uh-oh.
yeah, I know. But it's not really true. It's just that it's like maybe 50%, you know, every other thing. And it's
But you
because
get the
there are
gist of
certain,
it.
you get the gist of it. You can't really translate, but you think you understand. Now, obviously, it's not very accurate, but in a conversation, you know, you only in a conversation, you're obviously you anticipate certain things to be said. And so you get things in context, and that's where I think the understanding happens. So, yeah.
Well, can we, you just mentioned Trinity in San Antonio. Can we talk about your time there for a bit here? I know you taught there for 19 years and you left in 2010, if I remember.
That's right.
And of course, you know, I'm personally grateful that you left because it opened up an opportunity for me to come in and take that position. But I, before we get to the why did you leave question and what you've done since then, um, could you just talk about your time at Trinity for a bit?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that you said, you know, it's nice that I left so that you could be there. And I thought, you know, my predecessor was Frank Kelly,
Right,
and
right.
he left. Um, and he was kind of on the fence about like why should he leave, and then he thought, no, you know, USC is a better school,
Mm-hmm.
and then that spot opened. And I even have a friend who interviewed in that pool of applicants who came down, and I still keep up with him regularly. Um, so the time at Trinity was really great. I mean, I think they wanted to, you know, the hiring committee said they just want a Michigan composer, you
Ah,
know, and so I think all the applicants were all Michigan composers. I'm not sure, but I knew both of them. I still know both of the other, you know, the other candidates who were at other fine institutions. But when I got there, you know, there are two things that were interesting about Trinity. Um, the first one was it just never got cold, and you're waiting for that crisp fall air, and it's November. Where is it? Like today, we have, you know, it was in the 40s last night, and it's, you know, a high of 70 today or something. It's 67 out. It's that nice crisp air, and you think, oh, you know, you were in Kansas for a while, you know,
mm-hmm. I
right?
know.
Yeah,
Yeah, I lived in Minnesota for a time before that. Oh, yeah.
right. Yeah,
And yeah, so just by comparison, we are having a cold front right now. This morning, I believe it was 56 and the high is in the 80s, but give it a few more days and the high is going to be something like the low is going to be something like 78 again.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's the one thing. And the color, I was at Indiana State University in Terre Haute for a 1 year gig before I came down there. And at that point, you know, it was I think I did the interview in February. It was in Terre Haute in February is gray and brown and yellow. It's really, really pretty grim. And the spring hasn't sprung, so you come down to Texas and like colors everywhere. The bougainvillea is blooming and the river walk is, great it's
Yeah,
and
the, the
it's incredible.
Esperanza is nice and yellow everywhere. Yeah.
And so that was a dramatic shift. So, I'm talking about the weather and the climate on campus. Um, it's also really different for me because I was at a state institution where, it's like, okay, here's your photocopy budget for the semester. Don't use it all up in case you need it for your final.
I know that feeling well. Before I came to Trinity for 2 years, I taught at one of the UT schools, UT Tyler, the smallest and newest of the UT campuses. And yeah, we had a photocopy budget and they watched us on that.
Right. So there were certain things about that where, you know, it's just a radical shift. You come down to Trinity and it's like just photocopy it. What do you mean? Just whatever you want. And yeah,
Well, I think it's great that you had that 1 year prior at Indiana State because it gives you perspective for the really the luxuries that we have at a place like Trinity.
right, right. And I don't know if those will change in the coming years at small liberal arts universities, colleges. They haven't, oddly enough, even changed here at Illinois College, and we only have 1,100 students. But I think that's kind of nice to have a lot of flexibility in what you can do. Of course, Trinity didn't have, again, this is pre-internet. I would have to walk over to the library, and the CDs were the new thing, and check out CDs for my lecture, check out a score. If I was doing orchestration class, I'd have like a suitcase, and I would load it up with four CDs and 5 scores we're going to look at, and I'd walk back over to the that way. Nothing was streaming, and I remember even in the early years saying to one of the librarians, I said, wouldn't it be nice if when we have because they're doing email, and I said what we should have is like a library that's through the computer, and you just pull it up, and then I press a button and it saves my playlist, and you can play it from the computer. That was like 1997 when I was talking about that, and she's like, well, yeah, but I mean, we don't have that technology yet. Anyway, fairly common at this
Oh,
point.
sure. Yeah. Now it's the norm.
Yeah, but I do think we were in the older building too. You didn't know the older building. It was
I didn't.
kind of well, I wouldn't call it a dungeon, but definitely a darker room. I had a giant um, support pole that was basically in the middle of my office. You walk in and it was like next to my desk, holding up the everything. And so I didn't know though. I mean, my office at Indiana State University was actually very nice. It was large. It had a harpsichord in it because they put the harpsichord in my room because they said, well, you're a harpsichordist, so we thought we'd put it in your room. I said, great, so I could practice on it. I had a piano and a harpsichord in my room. And I get down to Trinity, and the old building was pretty tight. Like I had a piano that you could kind of get around, and a little door, and the desk was stuck next to the pole and
Hmm.
under the fluorescent lights, and I tried to make it cozy in there, but you can ask the old timers who are still there at Trinity about the old building. They'll tell you those stories, of what that was like, because that didn't feel as luxurious as the campus. The campus itself was quite nice, and the setup, the ability to have a lot of resources. The library had really significant holdings, and that was great. But the new building wasn't there yet, and unfortunately, I had to wait until, was it 2008 or something, or nine? I mean, the new building that's when we moved into the new building. So I think I was in the new building for maybe 2 years before I left. And that's that office, which is really a great
Yeah.
office.
Thanks for breaking in the office for me. Yeah, I have this
Yeah.
huge window and
Yeah.
I have a baby grand in my office. It's lovely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we can't
But
talk about your time at Trinity without, of course, talking about the founding of CASA, which all happened before my time here, of course. And so I've known CASA for the last decade, since I came here, but I don't have the kind of institutional knowledge that someone like you, as one of the founders, does. Can you sort of walk me through how and why you guys founded CASA?
so the original founders, David Heiser and I think it was Elisenda Fabregas.
Fabregas, yeah,
Yeah, and Fabregas teaches in South Korea now, I
right,
believe.
in Seoul, I
Right.
think.
Um, and what happened was, I know what happened. I was tenured in '97, um, and I was always talking to my wife, who was working on her dissertation, about, well, what about this? And what about that? And what about this? And she's like, I don't, I can't talk to you about that. You know, she doesn't have enough knowledge of the subject. I mean, she was a musician as well and a singer, but she didn't know about composing and networking and things of that nature. She said, you probably should start a group or something, you know. And David Heiser was having the same kinds of conversations, I think, with his family, you know, with his spouse. And David came in 90, I don't know, 94, 95, and we had met a couple of times. And I had Elisenda and David and probably Ken Metz too, I think was in on this. I would have them come over and present their music to the students, you know, in our composition seminar. And and I did that for a few years, but then we ended up, you know, meeting. I think it was as early as '97, and it might have been '98. About, you know, we just met at Liberty Bar, and it's like, well, what do we want to do? Well, we should start a composers group, like the Composers in Red Sneakers, who was like a group in the, you know, I think it was in the '80s that was started in Boston, or you know, or do we want to be the Texas Composers Forum? And it's like, well, I think there's already that, but it's, you know, all locked up in Dallas, and so um, so I said, well, why don't we just be the Composers Alliance of San Antonio, CASA, you know, Mi Casa Su Casa, you know. So
Mhm.
I said it has a nice ring, and we can just, so all we did is we informally met for about a year, um, a couple times at Liberty Bar, and we just exchanged ideas about networking and ideas about music. And then we started meeting in our homes, and we just went around initially to different institutions. And I know Ken Metz was pretty early on in this. At that point, Michael Toomey was teaching too at the University of Incarnate Word, and I think he has left San Antonio at this point. I think, I'm not sure, but so there were a number of early people around. Miso Kim was also in the area, and she was maybe doing adjunct work at UTSA. And so by, I think, 1999, we sort of established ourselves. Bill Ross came on early on, and that was actually, I remember talking to Bill Albright about this, and it was probably in '97, because um, he passed away in '98, so it must have been in '97. And he said, you should contact Bill Ross, Ross. He's an organist. He's a really great composer, and he's in your city. I said, what? Who is this guy? You know, so it's interesting to find that, you know, when you're busy like teaching theory and teaching composition, and you're, you know, just grading things, and you're, you know, trying to do work on the Senate as an assistant professor, and you're, you know, you're busy with like advising and, you know, change in the dean and, you know, all this stuff. You forget you have this really small world that you operate in. And I just thought, this is crazy. You know, when we're in a town of like 1.5 million or 1.3 million or something, there's got to be other people who are doing this. And lo and behold, you find out, yeah, everybody, there's lots of people doing it. I mean, there are probably 30 or 40 people actively doing this, some 20 at least that are in CASA now. And you just have to kind of make an effort to break out and meet other people, because you could just spend your whole life in academia grading theory papers and writing your music for the group that you know about, but not knowing about all the other groups that are around you and what's going on in the bigger world of, classical music. What's happening in New York and Chicago and LA, and, what are happening in those centers and who are those composers. So I really saw this as a kind of a way to refresh my experiences. And David and Elisenda were, key in wanting to do this stuff too at the very beginning and forming this group, and Bill and Ken. So that's how it got started. And, Bill did the heavy lifting of, he had a lawyer friend who helped turn it into a nonprofit, so we could have nonprofit status, so we could get money that people could then, deduct off their income tax. And we started with a pool of funds. And that really helped us a lot, like making the first CD, hopefully the first CD. We don't have a second one yet.
And it probably won't be a CD either now, right? But
Right.
some kind of streaming album, perhaps.
Right. Well, we'll call it an album, right?
Right.
And we could call it a CD, but it's really call it an album and release it in some format, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's such a great point that you made a bit earlier about how it's so easy for people like us to become siloed ultimately, where we go to work at our academic jobs and we teach our classes and furiously try to keep up with the grading load as best we can, and then we write for the ensembles that we know about around us and come home, rinse and repeat. And it can be difficult to remain part of the larger conversation writ large, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I struggle with that, and I know everybody in similar positions does as well. And I was very happy to come into, in fact, that's why we spoke on the phone that one time 10 years ago, is because you wanted to tell me all about CASA. And I was glad to have that somebody kind of laid the groundwork, did the plumbing, so to speak, for such an organization. And it's nice to have that around, certainly. And one silver lining of the pandemic is we have to have silver linings to these things, or else it's just all too depressing, right? But one silver lining is that the conversation that we're having right now is facilitated by the technology that has really had a bit of a boom since the pandemic started. And that has meant that people like you and Juan Luis, your former student, and Yvonne, another former student of yours, even though you all are living in faraway lands compared to San Antonio, that we could all be together again and have and speak to each other as if we're in the same room. And you as a founding member can once again, have an integral role in the organization. So that's great.
Yeah, that has been one silver lining, hasn't it? It's been really nice to be able to do this. Um, I know that I was reading something in a BMI newsletter the other day that there has been, at least over the last year, kind of an explosion of individual artists, and it's because the tools of being able to get your music out there are so much better for younger musicians who, and it doesn't matter what kind of music they're writing, they can, post things on SoundCloud, they can use social media to generate interest. My wife was showing me an app that she has, Insight Timer, which has a bunch of meditation, um, live streamed workshops, as well as music that you can listen to. And, I don't know what the filter is that they use to go through, but they'll have like musicians up there who play meditation music, or lighter music, piano music or something, but they, maybe have 3,000, 4,000 followers. And you don't need to make, extraordinary amounts of money to be a musician these days. You can just make a living, I mean, you could make,
Yeah.
you don't need to make $50 million. You can make 50,000. And as long as you're able to work in your studio and produce and collaborate, which is the other thing you can do now, I think that these tools are much more readily available for artists to be able to produce on their own and create a lot of music that way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, not only the dissemination, the distribution, the getting oneself out there of the music that you write, but also on the funding side, it's become much more of a multifaceted process where you don't need to have a single a large commission from a single individual or organization, but you could use other platforms for this, such as GoFundMe, Kickstarter, whatever it may be, and you can get funded from a large variety of people, all contributing just a handful of dollars, and that's could be your commissioning fee. So it's quite a different world now.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we still need, musicians who play really well because they teach us a lot about our own music. As I know you're having a piece coming up. I think you said in January it is, that Soli's playing.
In
And
January.
it's really nice to have that feedback from expert musicians who can give you different insights into your music that you didn't otherwise know about. So I don't know if the technology, I mean, certainly I know that the piece that I just finished for flute and piano for the Music Wall Duo, they said, well, we can do rehearsals over a low latency um, call, and we can do the rehearsals over the internet, which is extraordinary. But I still
Yeah.
need the people on the other side,
Right.
right? As opposed to some artists who either just play the piano themselves or have an electronic studio and they create things in a studio situation and then post that. Um, but I'm thinking that there is a lot more. It gets back to the very beginning of our discussion where I was saying, when I went to Germany, it was like, how did those guys even get my music? Oh, that's right. I made physical scores and physical cassette tapes, and I put them in FedEx boxes. So I wanted to ensure that they got there. Or was it DHL in those days? It was a company that did international shipping. And I had their address and a formal letter written auf Deutsch natürlich.
Hmm.
and then I put them in the box and I sent out 5 packages, which cost me a lot of money in those days, a couple $100 or something, which would be like, $1,000 in today's money or something. It was a really expensive thing to do. And I got a note back from every single one of them. I even had an opportunity, because I know one of the composers was Ligeti,
Mm.
and it was when he had the Grammar Award down in Kentucky. I drove down to meet him and his private secretary, who said he enjoyed your work very much, but he is not taking on any more private students. And he was getting quite old at that point. I don't know if he actually, if that was a blow off. I don't think he had any private students after that. But that was great. I mean, I at least got that feedback from a major master composer, but it was all done by personal correspondence. It was not over the internet. There wasn't any way to link you know, my clips, or send them
Hmm.
an email and whatnot. And in some ways, that made it so much more personal, too. I also had a nice note back from Maurizio Kagel, and you may know the name because he did a lot in music and theater, a very avant-garde composer who lived in Köln. And um, again, he was like, well, I really teach musical theater here. I don't actually teach composition, at the university. I've enjoyed listening to your music and, wish you the best of luck. And in any case, those kinds of interactions were slow. It was like 3 months, 6 months went by, right, before I had a response. And nowadays, it's just a simple matter of sending off an email or posting something or, linking to something on Facebook or Twitter or something, and then you can
Yeah.
make the connection so
Yep.
quickly, so easily.
Yeah. There's no more mailing of physical scores to Bill Bolcom as you did back in the day.
Right.
Those days are just gone entirely. Um, and I remember back when I was in college and studying composition and beginning to submit to various competitions. Even back then, this would have been in the early mid 2000s. Most of the competitions, especially the big ones like ASCAP, BMI, you had to physically mail in your scores as well as CDs to enter those competitions. And now almost all of them are digital submissions for these. In fact, you mentioned the Grandmeyer. I think that might be the only one that I've seen recently that still wants you to mail in a physical score as well as a CD. So,
Yeah. CDs now, that's the upgrade
right,
from cassette
right.
tapes. Yeah, that's funny.
Yep. Well, can we talk a bit about? I have a couple things left that I want to ask you about. One of them is struggling to think of how to articulate it about the creative process itself and the people who are doing the creation. I've noticed in my students, well, and most of my career has been at Trinity, but I notice in my composition studio, the students that I get who major in composition are often highly creative, and so they're high in personality trait openness, and they're often pretty low in conscientiousness, meaning their orderliness. And so I get these creative types who, not all of them, but many of them end up struggling with other aspects of their personal lives. Whether it's getting to classes on time, um, not sleeping till noon, so it seems that there's a pattern, and it's probably backed up by psychological literature, but it's just my observation that composers are frequently highly creative and struggle with various aspects of their orderliness of their personal lives. Would you say that's also true in your experience as a teacher of composition?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if most of the students I've had as composition students have been very on top of things. Now, maybe it's because I've had so few students. I mean, I usually, in my teaching career, one great student each year and some inexperienced, but usually, one or two each year that would graduate and really go on and either be a conductor or musicologist or composer or,
Mm-hmm.
great performer who composes. And most of them were extremely um, hardworking, dedicated, flexible. I haven't seen that here. I mean, the last person I graduated, who's now starting a doctoral program at Ball State this fall. He went to Western Illinois for a master's degree a couple of years ago, and he was just um, seemed to be very balanced and on top of things. He would often think that he's done with something
Ah,
when he wasn't. No, this I finished this piece, and I'd say, "What are you talking about?" So there was that. Is that his expectations were maybe for what he should do were maybe a little lower. But I thought that was more of again kind of a cultural thing where when you're at a small school, you're a big fish in a small school. You don't realize what's out there and the kind of talent that's out there in the real world, and how much you know competition there is in terms of those kinds of connections. Because you know that for many students who are really great, they're at Juilliard or Eastman or something, they're at these big conservatories, and they've already written maybe 20 pieces in high school, and one of them won a national competition, or one of them was played by their local regional orchestra, or and I think in small schools, sometimes in small schools, and Trinity, I would say, is a small school. It's not a large school of music.
Right.
The students may not have had enough exposure to that kind of national scope. They can be very bright and creative, but I don't know how. There is a little bit of a bubble, and we do this again. I've worked primarily through most of my life in small colleges, and so I know they come to the small college because they want personal interactions with their professors, and that helps them, I think, kind of emerge. But usually by their junior, senior year, they recognize that they're in a much larger profession that has thousands of people like them, right? Trying to get a performance or whatever. And I haven't found that to be true. I do think that, I think students, just personally, within the last 5 years, I think we've been, students are distracted by the amount of information that comes in through the internet. And again, I remind students of this. I had taught a first year seminar a few years ago, and they're just so different in terms of the way they learn. And I would talk to them about, well, in my day,
Right.
we didn't have telephones in our dorm rooms. We had a telephone down the hall, and no one used it because it cost,
Right. Yeah.
in terms of your money, $5 a minute to call home or something.
Yeah. There was a phone at the front desk of the dorm. I
Right.
remember. Yeah.
Right. So those kinds of things were so we didn't really have much to do because we didn't really worry about, at that point, what Nixon was doing or Reagan was doing or whoever was. We didn't worry about the day to day. If there was an explosion in a factory in Tennessee, we didn't know about it until maybe a day later, or not at all. It was taken care of there, local authorities. So there wasn't the pressing urge to read all the posts of everything that's going on. Not to mention sort of the social media piling on of what personalities will do, pop stars and actors and things that they will post that suddenly become newsworthy. So I think there's a lot of distraction for students. It's almost like, I wish that we could say, you need an artist colony, and here's how it's going to work for the next 2 weeks. Your phones are going in this trash bin.
Yeah.
And you're turning them off, and you can't use your phones. And you can't use your computer. You have to write music with pencil on paper. I will allow you a light bulb and a heater.
Yeah,
but you remember that
or candlelight. Yeah.
Right. J.S. Bach did not even have light bulbs.
No, he did not.
And he has over 1,000 works.
Right.
And some of those last an hour and a half long.
And
so
he also went blind at the end of his life.
And he did. And he would have been fine if he had a good eye surgeon.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I do think they get distracted by their phones. And when I mean that, I really mean the amount of content of media that's coming in. I mean, it's in some ways it's good because I think our awareness of, white supremacy and our awareness of global weirding and our awareness of how people treat each other around the planet has become much more real. But they also are studying a discipline that requires a lot of their attention. And I think it would be healthy for them to have a week or 2 weeks where they just unplug from everything and just focus on, how are you going to entertain yourself? Well, you're going to entertain yourself by practicing. You're going to entertain yourself by writing another 5 measures, by copying out this Bartok quartet. Yes, physically copying out from pencil to paper.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that those sorts of things are helpful for students to do. And I've never been able to accomplish that with students, like to have them go cold turkey for a week. I have done it for a 24-hour period, and they seem to feel a little calmer.
Mm.
But I think it gets to all of us, you know.
It does. A couple things I just want to say about that. I mean, first off, it may be that I am the first generation of composition students who never had to write anything by hand. When I was in college, I enrolled in college in 1997. These were still pretty early days of programs like Finale. And all of my teachers wrote things by hand. Maybe they were beginning to adopt computerized notation at about that time, but many of them still wrote by hand. My old major professor, James Barnes at KU, he finally adopted Sibelius probably in the early 2000s or so, about the time I met him. But he spent decades writing things by hand, and I never had to do that unless I was, say, taking an orchestration class with James Barnes, and he required that we write all of our projects by hand. Except for the final project, he did allow us to use computerized notation, but the rest of it was all by hand.
Mm.
And secondly, on distraction, I think you're absolutely right about that. It's so easy we can be constantly distracted. And some of the most productive periods of my own life compositionally have been, this would be back in 2006 and then again in 2008 when I spent summer in Greece as part of a summer theater festival there, working as a composer. And I lived inside an elementary school classroom that was vacated for a summer vacation. And I lived there with the people from the theater company. We had no phones and there were no SIM cards that would work at the time. So nobody had cell phone service. There was a single phone in the kitchen of the school, but we lived in a tiny village called Katohi in Greece. I mean, sheep still were driven by shepherds through the town square multiple times a day. And so there was no phone service. There was no television. We didn't even have air conditioning the first year. And I was more productive because of the lack of distraction in writing music for a performance of the Bacchae by Euripides than I've ever been at any other point in my life. And what was so nice about, I did have a computer. I had an Apple MacBook with me, but I had to, when I wanted to print, I had to walk into the town hall in the village and kindly ask the secretary if I could physically plug into her printer and print what I'd been working on that day or that week or whatever. But there was some lovely moments out of that, and the instantaneous feedback was nice too, in that maybe in the morning I would have breakfast with the director of the play, and he'd ask me something like, Brian, I'd like to rehearse the earthquake scene in the Bacchae this afternoon. Do you have music for the earthquake scene? And I'd say, well, no, not yet, but let me go upstairs and I'll write it. And so I would write the music that morning, walk into the city hall, print it, and bring it to rehearsal that afternoon. And then we'd rehearse it, that very day. And I think I was only able to do that because I didn't have anything distracting me. No cell phone buzzing, no television, no internet. I couldn't just fire open a browser and check the daily news or see what so-and-so had for lunch on Facebook. I couldn't do any of that stuff. And I was ridiculously productive as a result.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds great. You were like Papa Haydn.
Yeah, stranded at Esterhazy, right?
Stranded there. Just, what do you need? Well, we need some dinner music for Thursday. Okay, I'll get it
Right.
done today,
Time to do
and write
another
it out.
divertimento. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and essentially with your software, you have a part copyist,
Right.
because you're putting it in. But I do think that I know some people, I remember talking with Jim Ballantyne years ago about this because he made the switch and then he got so comfortable with, I don't know whether he uses Sibelius or Finale, but so comfortable that he would write in Finale. What I found is that, and I'm not sure if this is the case for other composers, but for me, Finale, I don't know if it's good for me. It makes me write my music more quickly, but I don't think it's better music. I think that it in some way makes it more like line up on the grid, because if I can't get a certain sound out, I remember in this flute piece, I have this movement just called Mourning, Mourning,
Mhm.
and it's for alto flute, and I want them to do quarter tones, and I want them to do glissandi in the low register. And if I were writing it out by pencil, it would have been so easy. But with Finale, it's like, oh, how do I make this line longer? And I gotta, oh, wait, quarter. Well, I want it to quarter. Where am I gonna get the quarter tone? I spend like 2 hours looking for the flat that's backwards,
Right, right.
and then putting it in. And if it were just pencil, the sound that I wanted would have just been a sketch in pencil, and it just would have been more elegant to write it that way. And so having that resistance, like in Finale, that it's not quite easy to do, makes me not write that hard music as much because it's too hard to do it in Finale. And I
You
think,
face a technical limitation,
yeah, you
or at
face those
least you've
tech.
got to figure out the technical issue.
Yeah, and I think for people who do it all the time, they know how to do it. Um, and I now do most, probably last, yeah, 10 or 15 years. I mean, it's been, I would say about 2000. It's about right. That's when my last piece that I didn't use Finale on was the first movement of my symphony, Bach meets Escher. So it was 2000, and that was in pencil, and it should have been in Finale. The parts are in Finale, but the score is not. And then the rest of it has always been Finale. I wrote a solo cello piece that was in pencil, about 2005. And again, it was the kind of thing where I had him do a lot of different things that would take me a long time on Finale. Well, now that everybody reads PDFs, it doesn't make any difference because it's a solo cello piece. It's great. I just have the PDF, and that's what cellists will take, and they read it on their PDF reader.
Right.
And so, so for certain things, I would say, pencil's very nice and flexible, and you can do things with pencil, expressive markings and lines and certain kinds of things that take a long time with kind of the engraved look of Finale or Sibelius. It makes it a little bit more flexible. But I would agree with you that if you can turn everything off, um, it opens up all kinds of possibilities. And then, there are some things you just can't control that you worry about anyway, like, oh, I don't know, the debt ceiling, right? Like every 4 years, the debt ceiling comes around, and why do
Right.
we worry about it? It's going to work itself out. It's really like you can't even do anything
Right.
about
There's
it.
nothing you or I can do about it. Right.
Right, right. But it's yeah, call your representative, but the
Hmm.
point being, there's a certain point where worrying about things that you cannot change take away time, creative your energy as well. So Albright and I used to have this discussion too, because I always said to Bill, the problem is I'm the kind of composer, I have to have my house cleaned and my checkbook balanced, and all the food for the week put away and all this kind of stuff before I can sit down at a clean desk and feel as though, okay, I can create. And he said, you're not going to write a lot of music that way. You've got to be able to write music even if your checks are bouncing and your dishes are dirty, and I just said, I know I'm probably not going to write as much music as you do because I can't, because my personality is I want to really have everything cleared off. So the best way, like at McDowell, that the best 6 weeks, it was like, they had internet, but you had to go up to the main house and log in, and was dial up, and it was slow, and it was just to check emails. I don't know, in 1998 maybe, or something news, but it wasn't even. Most of us would read the newspaper in the morning at breakfast. It was so much easier. You don't have any other. I didn't know what was going on, but you know, you can
Yeah,
create that way.
those couple of summers that I was talking about in Greece, where there was no internet, no cellular service, no regular phone, nor any television, I found myself several times. It was a little bit disturbing. I found myself instinctively at some point just going to open up a web browser. And then of course I'd realize, oh, right, I don't have any internet here. And I would close it. But that was disturbing how easily um, I was able to just to start slipping back into those habits. And I remember years ago, back around 2007, 2008, when I was writing my dissertation in Kansas, I was thinking about those times that I spent in Greece without those distractions. And I found that there were times that I had to physically crawl under my desk and unplug the Cat5 Ethernet cable from my computer, just so I would actually focus on my dissertation and not tempt myself with distraction. It's so easy, right? Because, oh, I'm just going to check the weather. Oh, I'm just going to check my email. And then the next thing you know, 45 minutes have gone by and you haven't written a single note, right? And so, fortunately, I'm a little bit more disciplined now. I don't have to physically unplug my Ethernet connection, but it's something I still think about.
Yeah, we had a one. We did this for a couple summers. My family has and now my brother owns it. It's a cabin up in White Pass, Washington. It's about 8 miles from the White Pass, Washington, in the Cascades. They've been having some fire problems up there, and we're fingers crossed. There's a big fire that's about 20 miles north that still keeps burning, but it's the cabin has an old kind of like a Hammond organ in it that doesn't lose, it's electronic organ, and but no internet access, no cell phone service. Some cabins up there had the internet cable ran in there, but so we went up there. I was 2013 and 2015. We would go up for like 3 weeks, and we're academics, so July, as you know, you can take off for a long time. But it was really nice because we couldn't check our email and didn't get any phone calls. And she was reading, and she's an English professor. She was brought a stack of books to read, and I was writing music, and that was just great for like 3 or 4 hours of the day. And the rest of the time was walking around in the woods and making a fire and going down to the lake. We could walk down to the lake and sit and have an ice cream cone. There was a little shop down there, but it was a very different pace, and I got a lot of music written. I had to write an orchestra piece the first summer we were up there. I got a lot of music written. A lot of things just worked out in my head because I wasn't thinking about all the other stuff. So, like at the end of the week, we would take her um, her iPhone and her iPad, and we would drive up to the White Pass summit, park in front of the lodge. It's the summer, so it's all dry up there and everything. And then we'd get a, a, a cell signal, and the phone was linked to the iPad, and we'd go through emails and delete stuff and answer. And we had an out of town, we're out of the country where we won't be checking our emails but once a week. But still, we'd had to do it because we had to go, because otherwise you get back and you have like 500 emails in your inbox.
Right.
And it'll take you a day or two to go through them. But it really takes, it frees up a lot of time. So, tell your students to just unplug for a few days and things will be better.
I have. That's one thing I have told them, especially, kind of circling back a little bit, those handful of students that I've had over the years that are kind of the opposite of you in the sense that, you sound like you're really high in personality trait, conscientiousness and orderliness, where you need to have that clean desk and your checkbook balanced and all that stuff. The handful of students I'm talking about are the ones who have dust bunnies under their bed, and they sleep till noon, and they miss classes more than they should, and they're so focused on their composition that they can't really be bothered with certain other things, and sometimes they end up taking a gap semester, or maybe they struggle with addiction in certain ways, even if it's something like internet addiction or social media addiction, or they have various types of perhaps mental illnesses. But these people I've tried to talk to them about distraction, and I've told them the stories about going to Greece and how I didn't have access to these things, and actually ended up being quite a blessing. And I remember coming home that first summer from Greece, and I came home, and this is back when most people wore wristwatches, right? And now not that many people do by comparison. Yeah, there we go. Maybe it's a generational thing. I don't know. But I remember I came home and I took off my wristwatch and I sort of tossed it in my dresser and thought, after a summer in Greece, when, especially in the villages, most people tell time by the half an hour. Like, oh, what time is it? Oh, it's about 2:30.
Close enough.
The precise minute didn't seem to matter that much. And that was really liberating for me, where I was used to having a very tight schedule and worrying a lot about, whether I'm late for something. Well, I still worry about that, but I seem to care a little bit less about the normal structure of my day. And so I would talk to them about these things, and I would tell them, you can't really say unplug your Ethernet cable, because most of them have laptops or some kind of tablets now. But I would say something like, well, turn off your Wi-Fi, just, and give yourself 45 minutes. And if you're working on this project, maybe say for this first section of the piece, I'm going to give myself 45 minutes and I'm going to work on it solidly, and I'm not going to do anything else. And then after that 45 minutes, a timer will go off, and then maybe I'll allow myself to, 15 minutes to like check Instagram or whatever it is people are using now. And then rinse and repeat, go back and turn that off and try another working session. And, it's sort of like the idea that I've a conversation with an advisee I've had before would go something like this. They'll tell me, oh, I studied for this test last weekend and I still made a C- on it. Well, okay, well, how much did you study? Oh, well, I was in the library for, 9 hours on Saturday. Well, then we have to sort of break it down. Okay, you were in the library, but how much of that time were you actually studying versus, oh, you were talking to your friends, you were looking at your phone, like you were checking your various social media feeds, and then you went and got coffee, and okay, you studied for 20 minutes out of the 9 hours that you were physically there. That's why you made the C-. So it's sort of like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think for me, I've been one that there was this when I was transitioning to between Trinity and Illinois College. A lot of my friends were up here because Lisa, my wife, she worked up here starting in 2002, I think. So for 8 years, we were back and forth on an airplane. But in that time, I would always take full year leaves from Trinity. So I had somehow 2, I think, full year leaves from Trinity. Plus I had a special leave that they gave me just to care for Lisa's mother, who was infirmed. And that was, so the joke here was because all my summers were here, and my, Christmas was here, and or back in New York City with her mom, and they thought that I actually didn't work maybe at Trinity because by 2002, I think I had Mondays and Fridays, no courses on Mondays and Fridays.
So
I would
you had
teach.
a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday course
Right.
week. Yeah.
And I would often arrive, there was a direct flight. I could fly in Monday night, and I would get ready and teach Tuesday from, I think it was an 8:30 class until 6. Same thing on Thursday. But I could fly back Monday night and sometimes fly out Thursday evening. Um, and I wouldn't do that every week, but every other week. And so all the people who saw me up here, all of our friends were like, "Do you really have a job down in Texas?" And I'm like, "Yeah, no, I really do." You know, because they would see me on the weekends up here, and they would see me over the summer. And I was in a book reading group over the summer, and for extended vacation, spring break, and Christmas, and then all the leaves that I had as well. They really thought that I just didn't. But the point that I'm saying is, I did that because I wanted to carve out time to also write music. And um, it really helped for me to kind of partition time at the university and then have that block and then have a large block of time. So in the times when I'm not flying and I'm not here, even on Monday and Friday when I was here and Lisa was in at the college, I would have a whole day where I would, a whole day for me would be 4 hours or something, a block where I could really just turn everything off and just focus. And then, oddly enough, I wrote a lot of music on the plane
I was going to ask
because,
you about that because that seems like a good time to do
yeah,
it.
you can't do anything else.
Mhm.
And I would often like grade all the theory Thursday night on the way up, and then Monday on the way back, I had at least 2.5 hours. There used to be direct flights between St. Louis and San Antonio. And it was just 2.5 hours of I would write music. And I was either writing physically on paper or I'd open my laptop and I was inputting information in Finale. And it really helped because you can't do anything else. I mean, yes, you
Right.
can get a beverage but really I would even just say, no beverages, I'm just going to work, and no thank you. And I would just work. But having that kind of isolation was really important. And I think that's the only way that I've been able to write music while doing all this other stuff here, is to have that things isolated. And then when I was really time crunched here, when I took this job in 2010, and it was extremely busy because I was chairing the department and chairing the fine arts series and a number of other things. I was involved in Senate. I would work, it was 8 p.m. to midnight,
Hmm.
and it was just a block of time that I could, because everything's done. Again, getting back to that, everything had to be done, and now I can work. But I wouldn't recommend that because that was very grueling. It was very difficult to do it that
Yeah.
way.
No, no thanks.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's no surprise that you ultimately ended up at Illinois College.
Right, right. And that's because my wife was here, and we were either, who's going to blink? Is it going to be Trinity or is it going to
Mhm.
be Illinois College? And we went through that. I did do another interview at SIUE, Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and I was very close to getting a job there, but it was still going to be a drive of like, a 50-minute drive away from Jacksonville and a commute. And I thought, no, the dean here was interested in what I was doing. And I actually did advisory work for her in 2009 and was essentially part time here while I was still teaching at Trinity, kind of doing an outside search and doing some evaluation of the program and things of that nature. So it just worked out. There was a older professor, an organist who had retired, and there was a position open, and they needed a chair, and they needed a reboot. So that just worked. It was a good time, and it hasn't worked for a number of other people I know who have spouses who are in academic fields. A friend of mine, Carl Schimmel, who's up at um, Illinois State University, and his wife, I think, still at Grinnell, a
Hmm.
Japanese instructor, and they go back and forth. But he's had, again, I think he just got a Guggenheim last year, so he was like, "I'm taking a year off," and he's just doing the whole balancing leaves with long drives with back and forth, and it's very, very, very difficult. Um, and it was a difficult time for us in terms of just that whole travel thing. But I think the leaves helped a lot. And academic life, as you know, is kind of, it's not a 9 to 5. It's
Right.
you're doing your work when you can do it. And if it's
Yeah.
from, 8 o'clock at night till midnight, that's when you're going to get it done.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Um, can I ask you about something I'm personally curious about? Um, our mutual friend at Trinity, Carl Leafstedt, has told me stories of your infamous frugality back when you were at Trinity. In fact, I don't want to say he's used the exact words notorious tightwad, but it's something like that. But and also I know through your own work with CASA, with the grant applications, and I know you have a keen interest in investing in finance. Can you sort of talk about how that all got started for you?
Well, it's funny. Yeah, I know. I don't like wasting money if you can do some other kind of savings, but time is also money.
Hmm.
It's more important, which is why I make these comments about, is it worth 10 hours of time to write a grant proposal for $1,000? I think I'd
Right.
rather just, not spend my time that way. I'm sure we could come up if each one of us chipped in $100, it might save us a lot of time and a headache. Um, but I think the investing thing was, I haven't been my my savings in terms of investing goes back a long time, back into the 80s of where I would invest a little money in something and mutual funds and whatnot. But after I came back from Germany, I tried to apply. This is good, this is news for young students. I've always said, I think I sent out, again, in those days, no internet, 88, 89, 89, I probably sent out like 200 letters to every single college in the tri-state area. Again, we landed in New York City and lived with my wife's mom in her apartment in Manhattan for a month before we could save enough money to move out to New Jersey. And at that point, I had one nibble, and it was to teach maybe music theory, or was it MIDI? I don't know what they wanted me to teach at Rutgers University Newark campus in their tall building, and it just was pretty grim prospects. I mean, again, I just figured by August, you come back and you've got a Fulbright and you're ready to go. And I would be like, oh, I think something will come up. I mean, I can drive to Connecticut, I can teach in New Jersey somewhere, I can teach in New York. And so it was like 200 letters that went out to chairs of departments that I got from the College Music Society book of listing who's the chair of all these programs. And I thought, certainly someone will be retiring or stepping out. I'll get a theory, something. Nope, nothing.
Hmm.
Zero, zip, zilch. Um, so I went through, my wife had used a temp agency, and she said, just go down to, the woman I used at this temp agency, and, you're smart and you're capable. And I did. So the woman interviewed me and she said, well, you're bilingual. And I said, well, I'm not really bilingual. I mean, I know some German. Okay. Well, I've got this Austrian National Bank and they need someone who speaks German. And I said, well, okay, I guess I could do that. And so I got into that bank as a temp. And it's kind of a funny story because I worked for the CEO of the bank, and I worked initially for a vice president who was really great because he was, I would answer his phone. I mean, it was basically a secretary. And and after about a couple of days, he said, "Come on in here." Saying, "You've never done this before, have you?" And I said, "No, no, I've never done this before." Well, let me give you a few tips. And that was really great because that saved my job. So I ended up working inside this bank and working for the CEO. We did a merger with then it was Wells Fargo. I don't know what happened since I left that post, but I ended up basically even for and I would always during the lunch hours I was copying my dissertation because it was a commission by the Rainier Symphony, and I had to have all the parts done. So, I'm in those days you copied all your parts out. So I'd like, I'm scoring and I'm copying the parts. I'm scoring. I'm copying the parts. It's a 25-minute orchestra piece. It's a lot of work, and everyone was really interested in what I was doing. In the lunchroom on my lunch hour. So I had a conversation with. So this is all about investing, right? So I had a conversation with the CEO, Fritz Heigl, who was Austrian, and he said, "Well, what are you going to do about money, though? It's great that you write music," because he understood what a composer was, And I said, "I don't know. Well, I'll probably end up teaching, and it'll be fine, And he said, "Well, you should look into investing, And so, and this was an investment bank. They didn't have a retail side. They weren't a commercial bank that had retail agents. And they had a trading floor. And so that's kind of where I got interested in different parts of investing and what they did. And the vice president I worked for, the vice president of finance that I worked for later in the same bank, who became the president of the bank, he actually let me kind of, I wouldn't say run the bank, but basically he was out of the country for a week. And I had, basically received instructions from him in the morning, and then I was making decisions about what he wanted me to do. And it was a really weird time. I had a limousine at my disposal, basically, and it was very strange, how I kind of stumbled into this bank. And he wanted me to go to graduate school at Harvard and get an MBA.
MBA, yeah.
Yeah, and do the accounting thing. And I didn't really want to do that. But there was a moment where I walked into a room. This must have been in '89. It had a room that it was a conference room. And on the other side of the room was the giant screen. This is probably like the size of most people's television screens at this point in their homes. But and I looked at it, and there's another conference room on the giant screen. And I said, "Where is that?" And they said, "That's Vienna." And I said, "Oh my gosh, is this?" Hey, I said, "Someone's walking into the room," and they went and they waved at me. And I said, "Who does this?" And I said, "It's this little company called Cisco Systems."
Yeah.
It's like, wow, man, that's amazing. How do they do this? So this was '89. We were doing email in '89 internally in the bank in '89. It had just come online. We were doing email. We had this video conferencing thing. So that's where I kind of got interested in investing side. And of course, I don't know about the frugality thing, but just the whole idea of having an ability to be able to make money that's outside of what I'm making to live, and trying to find good investments and things like that. So through the '90s, it was sort of always been an interest from me, and I had done some of that. And then in the late '90s, with the crazy internet explosion and the bubble of '98, '99,
and bust.
Yeah, I really got caught up in that in a big way, and it was quite a heady moment, where it was just crazy. You could double your money in a week, and it was pretty impressive. So that's that. I kind of got the bug then, and then in the late '90s, when I was even more solvent and was able to have all the student loans paid off and stuff like that. But I always figured that, I remember my colleagues at Trinity always bugging me that I rented an apartment and didn't buy a house. And I said, that's because houses aren't good investments. And they're like, "You're crazy. You're throwing your money away." And
A house
I
is
said,
ultimately worth what somebody else is willing to pay for it.
yeah. Well, at that point, it was just simply a matter of, it wasn't about controlling equity in a house. I said, real estate can be really great at times, and then real estate can really drop precipitously. And
as we learned in 2008, 2009.
Right. And I said it also costs a lot of money to maintain a home. And, not only in addition to property taxes, but all that kind of stuff. And a mortgage, was crazy. So, you put money in a mortgage and you'll pay twice what the price of your home is. So all of that's on borrowed money. So I think the whole frugal argument was they were frustrated that I didn't take out a mortgage and buy a home, and instead, bought a home with just cash only, and
Mhm.
never bought a car on a loan. I mean, I never borrowed money for stuff like that because it seemed like a way of just, again, you're losing money, you're making money on one end and losing it on the other.
Mhm.
Um, and that gets back to my banking story, because by the spring of the year, the orchestra conductor really needed the parts, and I could not copy them. I mean, I was copying them at night, I was copying them at lunch. I couldn't copy them on the bus to work, but I ended up hiring a part copyist. In those days, they had people you paid to copy your parts. And um, I would get my paycheck on a Friday and go to the part copyist on a Saturday and turn over at least half of it to the part
Yeah.
copyist
Wow.
and get my parts back. And I thought, this is crazy, But that's just the way it had to work in order to get the orchestra piece finished.
Well, I presume you did get it finished.
I did. Yep. Nice premiere. I guess it was 1990, maybe, when they played it. Yeah, I think so. Yep. It's actually on my CD. I should plug my
Aha.
CD.
Yeah, go
Um,
for it.
yeah. So a 5-score festival. And the recording there is a very nice one. But the best performance I had was by the Indianapolis Symphony, but I couldn't use that. They gave me a recording, for my records, but I couldn't use that recording on the CD. So now, 20 years later, the Janacek Philharmonic recorded it, and it sounds fine. It doesn't have that same glow that you get out of a really top-notch professional group, but it's more note accurate, and it's better balance and everything else.
Your
Yeah.
CD, does it also have the Bach meets Escher? Was that the name of the piece?
Yes, and that's just the first movement of the larger
Mhm.
Symphony BACH,
Right.
which I guess is Symphony number one. I never wanted to call it that, but that's it. You know, um, and oddly enough, it is the first and last movements as planned that get programmed more often,
Right.
because you can play those as independent works. Um, but it's nice to hear the whole piece, and it's not been done as a whole piece yet. So I never expected the interior movements to be standalone pieces, but I designed it that way just to be able to get more portability out of it. Because, as you know, most orchestra conductors don't want to commit 25 minutes to a new orchestra piece.
Don't I know it? Yeah.
But I don't know how long your piece is that you wrote for Trinity. Was that
It's
15
about 20,
minutes?
26 minutes.
26 minutes. There you go.
Yep.
Right. And it's hard to get a 26-minute, if it's a one movement work, it's
Right.
really hard.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, that
But
was
it's easier to break it up, so
Mhm.
having titles for each movement, and
Mhm.
kind of making sure the movements are self-contained. That was the original design behind that.
Where can we find your CD?
Well, I've got a whole
If,
bunch here in
if
my
one wants to
office.
listen to music from your CD, how can one go about doing that?
Spotify, iTunes, you can buy it on Amazon. It's called Sentinels. Timothy Kramer Sentinels. If you Google that,
Mhm.
you'll get a hit on, and most people just listen to it that way. For all your Trinity students, you could use your Noxo streaming service. It's
Yep,
there.
we sure could.
Yeah. So most people listen to it that way. In fact, the composers I've heard from, they're all listening to it through a streaming service. A handful of people bought it when it first came out, but I think that's more people I know who are older, let's say maybe over 50 and 60s and 70s, and they like actually buy a physical CD because they want to read the booklet or something. But that's pretty rare. I think these are mostly for me to send around to conductors, um, and radio stations and things like that. But they'll still use probably the streaming service. You know, quality's pretty well on streaming at this point. So,
Can I ask you a personal question?
mhm.
And if you don't mind me asking, you don't have any children, do you?
No.
And so the question's, it's kind of serious and kind of a joke, but um, was it a conscious choice not to have children? And would you like to borrow any of mine for the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, I think it was a conscious choice. It was not a priority at the time, and it was obviously, you know, difficult in terms of the commuting thing as well, um, and you know, we've also said, well, there are people who have children and they want them, and then there are people who have children who don't want them.
And there are people who have children who really shouldn't have them.
That's right, right. So it just never happened. And you know, you end up, and that is true, you end up having a different kind of life for sure. I can't imagine, you know, our friends here who have just one child, they're very engaged with, and we have another group of friends who have three. I think you have three, isn't that right?
That's correct.
And you think to yourself, how can you possibly do that and have a career and teach and everything else? You have to be very good at managing your time, um, because,
You have to fail at something. You just get to
right,
choose what it is you fail at.
because otherwise it just gets extremely difficult. And so, in many ways, that's made it easier. I mean, my wife is an academic and she's also does research and she publishes and she's working on articles and she does things like that. And I think it would be very difficult for both of us to have those careers and have done all this as
It
well.
certainly
Um,
would. And you
yeah.
know, it's been my observation that when there when a spouse when a couple are comprised of academics and both people are academics, it does seem to be very difficult to also either have children to bring them into the world in the first place or to manage them after that. It's usually somebody's career ends up taking a pretty big sacrifice. And so it's not entirely uncommon at all for two academics to forego having children. I honestly thought that was going to be the path that my wife and I went down. I never thought I would have children. I didn't really want them. I thought I cared too much about my career. And you know, it's just also difficult. Who wants to have kids during graduate school? Because you know, you're to come back to the whole finance thing, usually graduate students are quite poor, especially if both, you know, the husband, wife, or whatever, if both of them are graduate students and one isn't working a full time career supporting the other one. And that was the case for my wife and I. We were both graduate students at KU at the same time, both of us in the arts as well. So our stipends were pretty low compared to if we were in STEM as teaching assistants.
Hmm.
So I thought, no, we're not going to have kids. And then there's the whole issue of, well, now I need to finish a dissertation, and that pushes, you know, people somewhere close to the age of 30. And then there's the, I need to get my career started. And the next thing you know, you're 35. And do you really want to start having kids then? And there's like fertility issues potentially. And
Sure.
so it's easy to go down that path. And that's the path that I thought we were going to go down. And my wife really wanted uh, one kid. And she finally twisted my arm enough. I was like, okay, fine. You know, I'd already come to Trinity, so I was 31 years old at the time, and she had just finished her PhD as well, and was working part time at, you know, the Alamo colleges, and she even worked part time at Trinity for a while, and Northwest Vista, so forth. And we thought, okay, we'll try for one kid, see what happens. Well, we got one kid, and that was quite a shock to say the least, of figuring out life with this uh, pooping, crying paperweight of a human being. And but ultimately, I found that especially after about 6 months or so, I really enjoyed it. And it gave, I don't want to sound all hallmarky, but it did give me a kind of fulfillment that I didn't know was possible before. And I liked it so much. I like to say I talked her into 2 and 3, but that's it. We're done. And
Yeah.
so I think of someone like, J.S. Bach, who had 20 kids across 2 wives. I mean, granted, infant mortality was a much worse problem than it is now. And so they didn't all live, of course, but that he had as many. It's not just that Bach wrote so much music and that it's all of such a high quality as well. It's that he did it while also having numerous children. That's to me is the real genius of Bach. I have 3 kids and I can hardly get anything done. So
Well,
yeah,
I think you're probably a better father than Bach was.
well,
We don't know what he did. He may
right,
have he may have just sired them and let other people raise them. And
but
I
it's
mean,
possible.
except for JC, I suppose, who he had a
Mm.
fondness for. But I mean, I'm sure that there were a few who were like, "Oh, good son, you had to keep practicing," But
Right,
but I don't know. I know several of those didn't survive. It was a very different time, obviously.
sure,
But I
right.
do think that it takes nowadays. I think it takes tremendous time and effort for parents, and many of our friends who are academics, when they have children, I get it, man. They have a meeting. It's at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They can't do it.
Nope,
It's not going to work, and
that's right.
they're very severe about, it's like, nope, it's time to, that's it. That's enough for me. I can't give any more to this Senate issue or whatever. I am not going to come in the evenings. That's
Right.
my time at home. And I understand that totally. That's something that I think for people who don't have children, we always have to think, okay, well, it's really, really hard. And, we need children there, we need the next generation to solve these problems and take care of the earth.
Somebody has to pay into Social Security.
Right, 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 exactly. So, yeah, I think that that's tremendous. And it's really, I think some of the people, I know David Heiser, who had children, someone like him, I mean, he wrote an opera and he was doing all this, but
Yeah.
I think his wife worked part-time and raised those children at home. But I know that he's very engaged with his kids, and he just didn't sleep very much. He just tried to work around the edges, and he was extremely disciplined, where he had blocked out on his schedule 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. compose, and he was in his
Wow.
office at 8 a.m. composing. And then he'd answer his emails, and it was just, he tried to really keep those lines blocked out so that it was like nobody disturbs him, so he could have that block of time. I think whether or not you have children or not, you need to figure out for yourself, because there's always something else, right, that's going
Hmm.
to fill your time. Um, if it's just keeping up with politics or activism or whatever
Hmm.
you're doing, there's always something else that's going to fill your time, unless as an artist you say to yourself, nope, from 1 to 4 in the afternoon everything's unplugged and I'm going to work on my music, because that's what I have to do. And I can't have those distractions because it won't be as good. Whether it's, for some artists, they'll take a month off in the summer. Gustav Mahler used to do this, right? He would work all year as an orchestra conductor, and then in the summers for 2 months, it was retreat to a cabin. You know, everything else is done for me, but I get 4 or 5 hours a day where I can just write music and write these incredible symphonies. But it was, had to have that ability to focus for a short amount of time and let everything else go, as Bill Albright would say, right? Let
Yeah.
everything else
Yeah.
go. Yeah. So maybe you only get one kid into college. There you go.
Right. Right. No.
Yeah.
Um, what is it about cabins and composers? You mentioned a cabin earlier
Yeah.
here as well. And, I remember back in graduate school meeting Morton Lauridsen and having dinner with him once. And he talked about a cabin that he had in California where he would go every summer for a month or more at a time. And so another one of these deals where there's no distractions, there's no internet there, there's probably little cell phone service, I don't know. And he would just lock himself away for a summer, or I think of someone like Jean Sibelius as well, locking himself away and
Hmm.
just writing over something like a summer. I don't know, it sounds pretty nice, especially when there's a bunch of screaming kids in the background. A remote cabin sounds pretty good.
Yeah. Well, I think there are lots of different colonies that, you could go to, and it's really to set up the whole thing so that you can carve that time out for yourself. I know Morton Lauridsen's his cabin is in the San Juan Islands. It's up in Washington State,
Oh, okay, that's right. Yeah.
and it's a little island that he said that his that he doesn't compose during the academic year. Now it's different because I believe he's retired from USC. He hasn't been there for a while, but
You mean transitioned?
transitioning, right? Yeah, that's right. But he said he never worked during the school year. He would only work over the summer, and he did a lot of carpentry, and he just did it like it was, you just unplug and you get away from everything. But I never asked him, well, what about your kids, or what about your spouse, or what happens there, or whether they
Right.
all came along, or I don't know. But you do need to have some time set aside for yourself. And I think as a composer, you may not know as much about something else. We've all become armchair epidemiologists during this plague.
Sure.
Maybe you just listen to the CDC guidelines and forget about everything else because you're not going to figure it out. But instead, we're all like, what's the COVID rate in my county? And, what's the vaccination uptake? And how many people are, what kind of mask do I wear? I've done so much reading about this over the last year, but I think other people are like, I'm just going to put my mask on and get my vaccine and wash my hands. I don't know what else I can do.
Take vitamin D and just hope for the best.
Right. Take vitamin
Right.
D. Right.
Yeah.
And because I've got to get Johnny off to soccer practice or
Yeah.
whatever. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I have one last question for you. And now that you've retired or transitioned, from
Transition.
that's right,
Right.
from Illinois College, uh, what do you see in the next few years for yourself? What would you like to do?
What's a good question? I'm still teaching a couple students. I actually have private students now, and that's nice. I'm also learning to play. So I told you I was an organist like
Mhm.
40 years ago, and I have an organ in my house. Um, it's a it's a pipe organ. It's a tracker, and I want to learn how to play it again. So I'm going to go back and try and relearn the things that I learned in the earlier part of my life, like playing the organ. And I have a piano right next to it, and I'm relearning to play the piano. In fact, I just acquired the piano last month. So it just was voiced this week and tuned, and it's a nice grand piano, and I I need to practice it for my jazz quartet, which I'd like to play more jazz and learn how to improvise again, even better and better, um, and learn how to play the organ. So I want to kind of reconnect with my musician side while I also just keep writing the next piece of music. I have a piece, our a drumline instructor here wants me to write in his words, a really weird kind of cool piece for steel drum. And I said, great, Percussive Arts Society, let's do it. So the next and a piece after that will be for two pianos. So I'm always looking around for like what's the next project for writing, but I don't. Rather than grading theory
Mhm.
and attending faculty meetings, I'm learning how to play the piano again and play the organ again and reconnect with what I used to be able to do. Maybe I'll even learn Spanish again. I don't know.
And maybe, just maybe, if you've got the fingers for it, maybe you'll pull out that bass guitar again.
Oh, good point. Yeah, I'm supposed to try and I know what closet it's in, and but it's funny. I pulled it out and I try and it's like I remember certain things in my hands, but I can't push down,
Mm.
and my fingers are tender and they're not. It's funny. You just lose it. If you don't use it, you do lose it. And that is the case. So that's what I see, at least for the next few years. Just more of like, I would be interested always. I'm on the books for, teaching composition to one student here at Illinois College. If I have more, I would teach more. Um, Individual lessons in comp or theory. I'm actually doing theory lessons. One of my private students wants to go to graduate school in music theory, and he's never really written a paper. So it's an interesting kind of lessons that we have about analysis and stuff like that. So I like doing that and being engaged that way, but just one day a week, one day a week, a few lessons, and then practice, play, write music, and kind of do the things that you'd like to do as a professor
without the things that come along with it that aren't quite as fun, like the
right
whole
that you
grading load and the faculty meetings. Yeah.
right that you have to do, right, assessment, things of that nature.
Oh, right.
And I think that's there's a benefit in terms of emeritus professor, because I do have a nice grand piano here at home, but I also have one in my office, and I have an office still. I share it with two other faculty members, but we alternate days, and they're also part-time, or the other emeritus professor conductor is in there as well, other days of the week. But it's nice to have an office, a library, resources, photocopy privileges, right?
Without the budget. Yeah.
Right. So far, so far, and all of that. Although nowadays, my gosh, parts even for orchestras are going out as PDFs. I was really stunned that the Janacek Phil, they didn't want any paper. They wanted PDF parts for everything. And so, that's what I have now. And I've heard from other composers that they send those out to orchestras, and that they would rather have their orchestra librarians bind the parts and put those out than for you to send off these parts that are kind of, have eraser marks and are all marked up by other people. I like some of the bowings in my orchestra parts that I have. So I don't know what they do about that, but I could always, it's just interesting that a lot of this stuff is all digital. So, makes it easier. There's a lot of stuff to do as a composer, and I'm just learning how to do it, like posting, like having a web page that's up to date, as opposed to one that gets up to date every 2 years.
Every 2-3 years. Yeah.
Right. It takes up a lot of time, actually.
Well, being a professor emeritus gives you a bit more time to deal with those things. But it really sounds lovely, and I wish you only the best on these plans as you put them into practice and continue writing music. And one of the big surprises to me in this conversation is I didn't know how close you came to being Timothy Kramer, investment banker, instead of Timothy Kramer, composer.
It was close for a brief moment there. Yeah. And it was a weird, I don't know. I don't think I would have liked it. A lot of people in that industry, they just care about money. And that's, and a lot of good people who care about other things too, but they want to make money. But it's always important to, at least for long-term planning, to try and think about what you want to save for and all that kind of stuff.
I've heard it put once that some people are so poor, all they have is money.
Right. Yeah. It's true. Yeah, I have a little Chinese fortune cookie here that's stuck to my computer that says value time over money. Only time cannot be replenished. That's really true.
That seems like a good place to end it right there, too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking with me, Tim. It's been a pleasure. And like I said, I hope all goes well for you as in the next few years as you continue to work on projects and get performances. And I know we could find you on Spotify and iTunes for at least your orchestral album CD.
Mhm.
And is there any place else? You have a website, correct? Is it timothykramer.com?
It is. Hmm. Yeah.
Well, I guess that's that. Thanks so much again.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. A lot of fun.
Yeah, you're